Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most medicated decades in American history, the golden age of the anxiety pill. We're talking about Valium, Xanax, Klonopin, Ativan, and every other little tablet the pharmaceutical industry ever handed a nervous person with a glass of water and a hopeful shrug. Not the street stuff, not the dramatic movie stuff. I mean the real pills, the ones your doctor prescribed with a reassuring smile. The ones that sat in medicine cabinets from Pasadena to Pittsburgh, the ones that basically ran the 1970s on a chemical drip. So before we get into it, a quick and genuine thank you to everyone who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and honestly, this channel wouldn't be what it is without you pointing it in the right direction. If you enjoy what I put together here, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually mean it. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always 3 AM somewhere, and that tracks perfectly for this topic. The channel is also now live on Spotify, so if you want to fall asleep to this on your phone with the screen off, the link is in the description. Go find it. Now, dim those lights, put on a fan, pull your blanket up to your chin, get comfortable in the most civilized, temperature-controlled, non-lice-infested sleeping arrangement your ancestors could only dream about. Because tonight, we're going somewhere very specific, the inside of a medicine cabinet. Let's pause for a second, though. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be handed your first anxiety prescription? Did doctors just give these out like breath mints? Was there a point where benzodiazepines were literally advertised on television between soap operas and Jell-O commercials? Could you walk into a doctor's office in 1974 complaining of nerves and walk out with enough Valium to tranquilize a golden retriever? Was there a moment when the entire country collectively decided that the solution to modern life was a small pale tablet you wash down with a glass of Chardonnay? What happened when the science caught up with the marketing? And why, after everything we've learned, are we still prescribing these things in numbers that would make a 1980s pharmaceutical executive weep with joy? Congratulations, you've just woken up in the waiting room of American anxiety. The year is somewhere between the discovery of chlordiazepoxide and your last prescription renewal. The fluorescent lights are humming, the magazines are from 3 months ago, and the doctor will see you now. Before there were pills for anxiety, there was just anxiety. Raw, unnamed, and extraordinarily inconvenient. The 20th century arrived with a kind of velocity that previous generations had never experienced. Industrialization, 2 world wars, the atomic bomb, the Cold War, suburbanization, television, and the dawning suspicion that modern life, for all its refrigerators and automobiles, was doing something deeply unsettling to the human nervous system. People were anxious in ways that didn't have good words yet. They called it nerves, or neurasthenia, or simply being high-strung, terms that were less diagnoses and more polite acknowledgements that something had gone quietly sideways inside a person. The demand for a chemical solution to all of this wasn't born in a laboratory, it was born in the waiting room. Think about what it meant to be alive in, say, 1952. You had survived 1 depression, possibly 2 wars. You lived in a suburb that had been a cornfield 18 months ago. Your neighbours were strangers. Your commute was new. Your children watched a glowing box in the living room that nobody fully understood. The world was moving faster than human beings had ever had to move, and there was no cultural script for what to do when the speed itself became the problem. You couldn't call it depression necessarily because you had a house and a job and a wife and a lawn. You couldn't call it grief because nothing specific had died. You just felt persistently and without clear cause like something was wrong. Doctors noticed. General practitioners in the post-war decades were seeing waiting rooms full of patients who didn't have anything a stethoscope could find, but who were plainly suffering. Racing heart, trouble sleeping, a tight chest that the electrocardiogram kept insisting was not a heart attack, the hands that shook slightly in the morning, the drink that was becoming 2 drinks that was becoming 3. These patients didn't fit neatly into the categories medicine had available. They weren't psychotic. They weren't classically depressed, not in the way that word was used then. They were anxious, and the anxiety was real, and they needed something. The word neurasthenia, coined in the 19th century, had been the previous era's attempt to put language around this experience. It suggested a kind of nervous exhaustion, the idea that modern civilization was depleting some finite nervous resource, like a battery that civilization was drawing down faster than it could recharge. It was, by any scientific standard, not a very good concept, but it captured something true about the experience, that modernity itself was the illness, or at least the cause of it. The city was too loud, the pace was too fast, the expectations were too many, the relief was too scarce, and here is the part that makes the whole benzodiazepine story make sense. The anxiety was not imaginary. This is worth saying clearly because the medical establishment of that era had a tendency, and the popular culture had an even stronger tendency, to treat anxiety as weakness, as a failure of character, as the kind of thing a person ought to simply manage through willpower or prayer or taking a walk. The people sitting in those waiting rooms were not weak. They were responding quite rationally to an environment that had been redesigned at a pace the human nervous system was never built to accommodate. What they needed, ideally, would have been something complex: rest, meaning, community, time. What was on offer was a prescription pad and 15 minutes. And so when a small white tablet arrived that could, reliably and quickly, turn down the volume on all of it, the racing heart, the tight chest, the 3 a.m. certainty that everything was falling apart, the demand was not manufactured by pharmaceutical marketing. The demand was already there, waiting. The pill just answered it. It is worth appreciating, before we arrive at the elegant pharmacology of the benzodiazepines, just how genuinely terrible the alternatives were. Prior to the 1950s, the standard toolkit for managing anxiety included bromide salts, which worked reasonably well until they accumulated in your body and gave you something called bromism, a condition involving confusion, hallucinations, and a rash that did nothing for your social life. Before that, there was chloral hydrate, the original knockout drops, which had the nuanced dosing window of somewhere between you fall asleep and you stop breathing. There was paraldehyde, which smelled so powerfully of industrial solvent that patients could be identified from across the room. And of course, there was alcohol, which humans had been using for approximately 10,000 years, and which remained, as far as most people were concerned, perfectly adequate. The barbiturates represented the first serious pharmaceutical attempt to do better than all of the above, and in some ways they succeeded. Phenobarbital arrived in 1912, and the barbiturate class expanded through the following decades to include a range of compounds used for anxiety, insomnia, seizures, and surgical anesthesia. They worked, that is not in dispute. The problem was that the margin between a therapeutic dose and a dangerous one was narrow enough to cause significant concern, not hypothetically, but in practice, in emergency rooms, in coroner's reports, in the quietly accumulating statistics of accidental and deliberate overdose that attended their widespread use. Marilyn Monroe died with barbiturates in her bloodstream in 1962. She was not unusual in that, only famous. Across the post-war years, barbiturate overdose was a significant cause of death, and the medical establishment knew it. Prescribers knew it. The patients, to a greater degree than the official record usually acknowledged, knew it. When Nembutal and Seconal were in the medicine cabinet, there was an implicit understanding of what they could be used for in extremis, and that understanding cast a shadow over every prescription. The alternatives at the margins were not encouraging either. Meprobamate, sold as Milltown in the United States from 1955, was briefly the most prescribed drug in American history, a tranquilizer that worked through a different mechanism than the barbiturates, but carried its own dependency risks and its own overdose profile. It was enormously popular, celebrated in the press, discussed openly at dinner parties, in a way that prescription drugs had not been discussed before, and then gradually revealed to have most of the problems it was supposed to solve. Milltown became a cautionary tale before Valium had even been invented. The picture, in other words, was this. There was an enormous, genuine, well-documented need for something that could quiet a nervous system safely. The drugs that existed could quiet it, but not always safely, and not without their own serious costs. The barbiturates worked until they killed you. The bromides worked until they poisoned you. The alcohol worked until it destroyed your liver and your marriage and your liver again. What the era was waiting for, without quite knowing it was waiting, was a drug that had all of the calming effect and none of the lethality. A drug that was, in the language the era would eventually settle on, safe. Whether that turned out to be entirely true is a question we will spend considerable time with, but the desire was understandable, the need was real, and the stage was set. The story of how benzodiazepines were discovered is one of those wonderful episodes in science where the right answer arrived through something very close to accident, which should perhaps tell us something about the pharmaceutical industry in general. In the late 1950s, a chemist named Leo Sternbach, working at Hoffmann La Roche in New Jersey, was tasked with finding a new class of tranquilizers to compete with the barbiturates then dominating the market. He synthesized a series of compounds, found them pharmacologically inert, and essentially shelved the project. 2 years later, a lab assistant was cleaning up and found one leftover compound that hadn't been tested. They tested it. It sedated mice more powerfully than anything they had seen. Sternbach named it chlordiazepoxide. The world would come to know it as Librium. It was 1957, and the modern anxiety pill had been born inside a pile of forgotten chemistry notes. Leo Sternbach was not, by his own account, looking for anything in particular when he found it. He had been working in organic chemistry since before the war, had fled Europe for the United States in the early 1940s, and had arrived at Roche with a background in dye chemistry that was not obviously relevant to pharmacology. The task of finding a new tranquilizer was assigned to him somewhat incidentally, the way large organizations sometimes assign transformative projects to people who happen to be available. He worked through a series of compounds derived from a chemical family he had studied decades earlier, found nothing interesting, wrote a brief note concluding that the direction was probably a dead end, and moved on. What happened next depends slightly on which account you read, but the essential shape is consistent. A lab assistant named Earl Reeder was cleaning out a storage area in 1957, found a compound that had been synthesized but never tested, and submitted it for routine pharmacological screening. The screening results that came back were unusual enough to get attention. The compound relaxed muscle tension in animals, reduced aggression, produced sedation, and did all of this at doses far below what would be lethal. The therapeutic index, the ratio of effective dose to dangerous dose, was significantly wider than anything in the barbiturate class. Sternbach and his team went back to look at what the compound actually was, and in doing so realized they had misidentified its chemical structure 2 years earlier. It was not what they thought it was something new. The subsequent testing was thorough. Animal studies were followed by human trials. The human trials showed what the animal studies had suggested. The drug reduced anxiety, relaxed muscles, and produced mild sedation, and it did this without the narrow safety margin that made barbiturates so dangerous. Patients tolerated it well. The side effect profile was manageable. The clinical data were, by the standards of the era, genuinely impressive. By 1960, Hoffmann La Roche had a drug ready for market, and they knew they had something significant. What they did not know, what no one knew, because the long-term data simply did not exist yet, was quite how significant the complications would eventually become. What Sternbach had stumbled into through misfiled notes and a tidy lab assistant was a molecular architecture that the brain found extraordinarily hospitable. The benzodiazepine scaffold, as chemists came to call the basic structure, would turn out to be modifiable in dozens of ways that produced dozens of different drugs with different properties. The accident was not just the discovery of a single compound, it was the discovery of a whole pharmacological kingdom. Chlordiazepoxide hit the American market in 1960 under the brand name Librium, and the rollout was, by pharmaceutical standards, almost modest. Hoffmann La Roche positioned it as a safer alternative to barbiturates, which it genuinely was, The therapeutic window was wider, meaning the gap between a calming dose and a lethal dose was significantly larger than with the older drugs. Doctors were cautious at first, the way doctors always are with something new, which is to say they were cautious for approximately 18 months before writing prescriptions at a rate that made the accountants at Roche very happy indeed. Librium found a home in the treatment of alcohol withdrawal, in the management of pre-surgical anxiety, and in the growing category of what physicians were beginning to call the worried well. People who were not clinically unwell by any traditional measure, but who were, to put it plainly, not coping particularly brilliantly with their lives. The name Librium was not accidental. It derived from equilibrium, which was exactly the mood Roche wanted to conjure. Balance, steadiness, a return to a baseline that anxiety had disrupted. In the marketing language of the era, this was framed not as sedation, but as restoration. You were not being chemically flattened. You were being returned to your natural state. The distinction mattered to both prescribers and patients, because it separated Librium from the stigma that attached to stronger psychiatric medications. This was not the kind of drug that meant you were unwell. It was the kind of drug that meant you were temporarily out of balance, and balance was now available by prescription. The early clinical experience with Librium was generally positive. Physicians who had been managing anxiety with barbiturates found the new drug easier to work with, the side effects more manageable, the patients more functional at therapeutic doses. Alcohol withdrawal, which had been a genuinely dangerous clinical situation managed with drugs that carried their own serious risks, became somewhat easier to handle. The muscle relaxant properties made it useful in physical conditions with an anxiety or tension component. Roche had clinical papers to show, real data, real patients who had done better than they had before. What the early Librium period also established, without quite intending to, was a cultural grammar for how benzodiazepines would be discussed for the next 3 decades. The framing was medical, not pharmaceutical. The patient was suffering from something real. The drug was addressing that real thing. The prescriber was helping. This is not a cynical framing exactly. In the early years, that description was largely accurate, but it created a conceptual structure that would prove very resistant to revision, even as the evidence for complications accumulated. Librium was the prototype not just of the drug, but of the story the drug would tell about itself. By 1963, when diazepam arrived to overshadow it, Librium had established that there was a mass market for a drug with this profile. Millions of prescriptions had been written. The drug was on pharmacy shelves across the country. General practitioners had incorporated it into their standard toolkit for the nervous, the sleepless, and the persistently out of sorts. The infrastructure for what was about to happen, the Valium decades, was already in place. Librium had built the road. Valium was about to drive a freight train down it. If Librium was the opening act, Valium was the headliner, the encore, and the after-party. Diazepam was synthesized by Leo Sternbach in 1959 and reached the American market in 1963 under the Valium brand name, and what happened next is one of the most remarkable commercial stories in the history of medicine. By 1968, Valium was the most prescribed drug in the United States. By the early 1970s, it was the most prescribed drug in the entire Western world. Between 1969 and 1982, it was the best-selling pharmaceutical in America every single year without exception. At peak consumption, somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 billion tablets were being dispensed annually in the United States alone. 2 billion. That is roughly 10 pills for every adult in the country, which means that either the math was evenly distributed, or some people were doing considerably more than their share. The pharmacological improvements diazepam offered over chlordiazepoxide were real, but not revolutionary. It was more potent by weight, which meant smaller tablets. It was absorbed more reliably. Its metabolic profile was somewhat better understood. But the leap from Librium to Valium was not primarily a scientific one. It was a marketing one, executed with a sophistication that was genuinely impressive, even if some of its long-term consequences were not. Roche positioned Valium not just as an anxiety drug, but as a treatment for the full spectrum of what it called psychic tension, a category so broad it could plausibly include almost anything a person in the 1960s or 70s might be feeling on a Tuesday afternoon. The colours helped. Valium came in yellow for 2 mg tablets, white for 5, and blue for 10. This was practical pharmacy, but it also created a visual identity that embedded itself in the culture. The little yellow Valium, the small blue pill, these phrases entered ordinary speech in a way that no previous prescription drug had managed. People talked about their Valium the way they talked about their vitamins, which was exactly the normalization Roche's marketing strategy was designed to achieve. Consider the moment you are in. It is 1971. You have 3 children, a mortgage, a husband who travels for work, and a persistent feeling you cannot quite name. A background hum of worry. A tightness in your chest that appears without warning. A difficulty sleeping that has been going on for 8 months. You go to your doctor. Your doctor, who has 30 patients to see that day, listens for several minutes, asks a few questions, and reaches for his prescription pad. He writes, Valium, 5 mg, as needed. He says it will take the edge off. He's not wrong. What nobody says, because nobody knows yet, or because what is known is not yet being said in the examining room, is how long you will be taking it. Nobody mentions that the body adjusts. Nobody discusses what might happen if you try to stop. Nobody raises the possibility that the drug is extremely good at treating the symptom, while the underlying cause continues untreated beneath it, growing in the silence of the suppressed nervous system. The prescription is written. The pharmacy fills it. You take the first one that evening, and the hum goes quiet, and you sleep. And for now, that is the whole story. The rest of it will arrive later. Understanding why benzodiazepines feel the way they feel requires a brief visit to the part of your brain that handles fear, and specifically to a receptor called GABA A, which is essentially your nervous system's built-in brake pedal. GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, which is a technical way of saying it is the chemical that tells your neurons to calm down and stop firing so enthusiastically at everything. Benzodiazepines do not produce GABA. What they do is attach to GABA receptors and make them significantly more sensitive to whatever GABA is already present, amplifying the braking effect. The result, at therapeutic doses, is a reduction in anxiety, a loosening of muscle tension, a quieting of the thought loop that at 2 a.m. is usually replaying every embarrassing thing you've ever said at a party. It is, in its way, a pharmacological approximation of peace. The brain is not a passive system. It responds to changes in its chemical environment with countermeasures, the way any complex system responds to outside interference. It adjusts. Think of it like a thermostat that keeps getting overridden. You turn down the heat. The thermostat eventually compensates by recalibrating its baseline. The brain, confronted with a drug that is constantly enhancing GABA activity, does something functionally similar. It begins to reduce the number of GABA receptors, or reduce their sensitivity, in an attempt to restore its original balance. This process is called down-regulation, and it is the biological foundation of tolerance and dependence. The drug is no longer doing what it did at the beginning, because the brain has changed in response to it. The specific geography of the brain that benzodiazepines affect explains much of the clinical picture. The amygdala, which processes fear and threat response, is heavily modulated by GABA, which is why benzodiazepines are so effective at reducing anxiety specifically. They are quieting the structure most responsible for generating it. The hippocampus, involved in memory formation, is also affected, which explains the amnesiac properties that range from mildly inconvenient in therapeutic use to clinically significant in higher doses. The cerebellum, which coordinates movement, accounts for the muscle relaxation and the impaired motor coordination that makes operating heavy machinery inadvisable. The drug is not doing one thing, it is doing several things simultaneously. to several different systems that were all being held in check by the same braking mechanism. What makes the benzodiazepine effect subjectively distinctive, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, Rex, is the quality of the anxiety reduction it produces. People who have taken these drugs for legitimate anxiety often describe not the absence of the anxious thought, but the absence of the anxious response to the thought. The worry is still there technically, you can still locate it if you look. But its urgency is gone, its physical dimension is gone, the racing heart and the tight chest and the certainty of impending catastrophe. All of that is simply absent. The thought sits in the mind like a document on a desk instead of a fire alarm going off in a building. You can look at it without it consuming you. That experience is, for someone who has spent years being consumed, genuinely revelatory. It is also, as it turns out, difficult to give up. Not just psychologically, though the psychology is real, but biologically, because the brain that has reorganized itself around the constant presence of that enhanced GABA signal is not the same brain it was before. The mechanism that was meant to provide relief has become, for a subset of patients, the mechanism of a new problem. The brake pedal has stopped being something you choose to press. It has become something you cannot drive without. To understand how Valium became what it became, you need to understand what a doctor's appointment looked like in the early 1970s, which was quite different from the managed care 12-minute electronic records experience of today. Physicians had time, or at least they had more of it, and they had considerable autonomy. The pharmaceutical sales representative had also arrived, bearing studies, samples, and a smooth conviction that whatever was troubling their patient population, Valium was a reasonable answer. The diagnostic bar for an anxiety prescription was, in retrospect, remarkably low. Nervous qualified, stressed qualified, having a hard time qualified. There was a genuine belief in the medical community, actively cultivated by Roche's marketing, that long-term Valium use was safe, effective, and preferable to leaving patients in distress. The refill was almost automatic. The relationship between physicians and pharmaceutical representatives in this era is important to understand and easy to romanticize in the wrong direction. It was not simply a story of venal doctors being corrupted by free pens and lunch. Many of the physicians writing those prescriptions genuinely believed they were helping their patients, because the information available to them, the information actively distributed to them by the people with the most financial interest in their prescribing habits, strongly supported that belief. The studies showing safety and efficacy were real. The studies showing long-term complications were not yet published, or not yet widely circulated, or were published in journals that general practitioners did not typically read. The picture presented to the average family doctor was incomplete, and the doctor had no particular reason to suspect that it was. The structure of the 1970s general practice also shaped what was possible in a consultation. A patient sitting across from a physician describing tension, sleeplessness, and a persistent sense of dread did not receive a referral to a specialist, because specialist access was different then, and psychiatry carried a stigma that made most patients reluctant to pursue it. The GP was the endpoint of care. Whatever happened in that room was the treatment, and the treatment that was available, that worked quickly, that patients experienced as helpful, and that the physician had been given good reason to believe was safe, that treatment was in the prescription pad. There is something almost poignant about the confidence of that era in retrospect. The science of psychopharmacology was young and optimistic. The idea that the brain was a chemical system that could be tuned, adjusted, and corrected through the application of the right compounds was genuinely exciting and not obviously wrong. The drugs worked, in the short term, in ways that were measurable and real. The side effects were manageable. The patients felt better. The doctors felt effective. The pharmaceutical companies were profitable and, at least in the beginning, not entirely wrong about their product. The tragedy of the Valium era is not a simple story of greed overcoming science. It is a story of incomplete knowledge applied at enormous scale before the incompleteness was understood. And then the scale makes everything worse. When you prescribe a drug to one patient and the long-term effects are uncertain, you are running a small risk. When you prescribe it to 2 billion people per year, the small risks accumulate into a very large problem, the shape of which only becomes visible from a distance when enough time has passed and enough data has arrived that the pattern can finally be seen. By the time that pattern was visible, the prescriptions had been running for 20 years. No discussion of Valium's cultural moment is complete without confronting the demographic that became most publicly associated with it. Middle-class American and British housewives of the 1960s and 70s. The Rolling Stones sang about it in 1966. Sociologists wrote papers about it. Magazine features explored it with a mixture of concern and the vaguely condescending tone that characterized most discussions of women's inner lives during that era. The reality was nuanced in ways the coverage rarely captured. Many of these women were genuinely suffering from isolation, from the gap between the life they had been promised and the life they were actually living, from depression that was underdiagnosed and undertreated because the medical establishment of the era was not particularly curious about what women felt. Valium did not solve any of that. What it did was make the suffering quieter, which was convenient for everyone except the person doing the suffering. The housewife narrative attached to Valium so persistently, partly because it was visible and partly because it made a good story. The tranquilized suburban woman, her edges chemically smoothed, moving through her kitchen in a state of managed numbness. It was satirizable, criticizable, and it became one of the primary cultural frames through which benzodiazepine overuse was discussed in the 1970s. Betty Friedan had published The Feminine Mystique in 1963, documenting what she called the problem that has no name, the diffuse unhappiness of educated women confined to domestic roles. Valium became, in the popular imagination, the chemical answer to Friedan's political problem. Instead of changing the conditions that produce the distress, you change the person's response to the conditions. It was cheaper, faster, and much less disruptive to existing arrangements. What this framing obscured was the breadth of Valium's use across gender and class lines. Men were prescribed Valium too, for occupational stress, for adjustment disorders, for the same range of presentations that were producing prescriptions for their wives. Elderly patients received it for sleep and for what was called geriatric agitation. College students received it for exam anxiety. Athletes received it for performance nerves. The housewife image was both accurate and misleading. Accurate in identifying a real pattern of prescribing and a real population of dependent patients. Misleading in suggesting that the problem was confined to one demographic. Valium was distributed fairly democratically across the worried population. The women who became dependent on Valium in this era occupy a peculiar position in the history of the drug. They were, simultaneously, patients who had been failed by a medical system that prescribed without adequate monitoring, and figures who became objects of cultural mockery. The medicated housewife, dulled and compliant, the punchline of a joke about modern womanhood. The joke, if you think about it for more than a moment, is not funny at all. These were people in genuine distress who were given a drug that helped them function in the short term, and then discovered, sometimes years later, that stopping it was a medical event requiring careful management. That they were frequently not believed when they reported withdrawal symptoms was, in part, a consequence of the same condescension that had shaped the original prescribing. The story begins and ends in the same place. The pharmaceutical marketing of the 1960s and 70s was a different beast from what exists today, operating in a regulatory environment that seems almost quaint in retrospect. Direct-to-consumer advertising for prescription drugs did not yet exist in its modern form, but that did not prevent Roche from running advertisements in medical journals that were, by any honest reading, extraordinary documents. One famous ad showed a woman surrounded by the mundane objects of domestic life, a mop, a broom, a sink, with the suggestion that the anxiety of falling short of her own housekeeping standards was a medical condition requiring pharmaceutical intervention. Another campaign marketed Valium explicitly for the anxiety that comes from everyday tension, which is a description of being alive that applies to approximately everyone. The message, refined across thousands of ads over 2 decades, was simple. Anxiety is a disease, and we have the cure. The sophistication of the Roche marketing operation in this era deserves genuine acknowledgement. These were not crude campaigns. They were carefully researched, finely targeted, and built on a real understanding of how physicians made prescribing decisions. The ads in medical journals did not speak to patients. They spoke to doctors, and they spoke in the language doctors responded to. Clinical evidence, safety data, patient outcomes. The tone was collegial rather than promotional. Here is what we know about this drug. Here is who benefits from it. Here is the evidence you can show your patients. The pitch was embedded inside the packaging of information. The expansion of the diagnostic category was gradual enough to be difficult to notice at the time. Early Valium advertising targeted relatively specific presentations: acute anxiety, situational stress, adjustment reactions. Gradually, over years and across hundreds of individual ads and promotional materials and continuing medical education events sponsored by Roche, the category expanded. Anxiety associated with cardiac conditions, anxiety in elderly patients, anxiety in premenopausal women, anxiety in the workplace, anxiety in retirement, anxiety in the face of any of the normal difficulties of a human life, each one reframed as a medical condition with a pharmaceutical solution. By the mid-70s, the definition of anxiety appropriate for Valium treatment had quietly expanded to encompass something very close to ordinary human unhappiness. The cultural penetration went beyond the medical journals. Valium appeared in newspaper columns, in advice literature, in the casual conversations that people had about their health, in a way that no previous prescription drug had managed. It was discussed openly, without stigma, which was both a marketing achievement and a sign of genuine cultural normalization. People mentioned their Valium the way they mentioned their blood pressure medication. It had become, within a decade of its introduction, part of the furniture of modern life. The question of whether the furniture was load-bearing, whether people could remove it without the room collapsing, was one that the marketing, with characteristic thoroughness, had not addressed. Roche did not hold the benzodiazepine market to itself for long. The basic molecular architecture of diazepam was not patentable in a way that prevented modification, and throughout the 1960s, 70s and 80s, a succession of competitors arrived, each with slightly different properties that gave them distinct clinical identities and, more importantly, distinct marketing angles. Clonazepam, sold as Ativan, arrived in 1977 with a shorter duration of action and a profile that made it particularly useful in hospital settings and acute anxiety situations. Clonazepam, sold as Klonopin, was longer acting and found strong footing in the treatment of panic disorder and, critically, seizures. Alprazolam, Xanax, arrived in 1981 and would eventually surpass even Valium's commercial dominance, becoming in its own era something close to a cultural shorthand for anxiety itself. Each new drug in the class brought genuine pharmacological differences that mattered clinically. Duration of action is among the most important. A long-acting benzodiazepine like diazepam, which has active metabolites that persist in the body for days, produces a smoother, more sustained effect and a gentler withdrawal curve. A short-acting one like lorazepam or alprazolam produces faster onset and a faster drop, which means more relief, more quickly, and more urgency when the dose wears off. This distinction between the pharmacological tortoise and the pharmacological hare would turn out to have significant implications for which drugs were most likely to produce the kind of rapid, intense dependency that became associated with the class at its most problematic. Ativan carved out a particular niche in hospital medicine that it still occupies. Its predictable absorption profile when given by injection, its relatively short half-life, and its efficacy in acute anxiety and alcohol withdrawal made it the benzodiazepine of choice for emergency and critical care settings. This was a legitimate clinical application. The problems with Ativan were not primarily in the hospital. They were in the outpatient prescription that began as acute treatment and then, through the familiar mechanism of continued renewal, became chronic maintenance. The drug that was perfect for a 3-day course became, for many patients, a years-long commitment that nobody had explicitly agreed to. Klonopin arrived with the specific advantage of anticonvulsant properties that gave it standing in neurology as well as psychiatry, and its long half-life was, at least initially, seen as a clinical advantage. A smoother ride, less peak and trough effect, presumably a gentler dependency profile. The reality proved more complicated. The long half-life meant that tolerance built slowly but dependence built deeply, and the withdrawal from clonazepam, drawn out, subtle and lasting, became something that patients and eventually researchers described in terms that made the classic benzodiazepine withdrawal look almost manageable by comparison. Each drug in the class had its particular story of how the same basic mechanism found a new way to create the same basic problem. Xanax deserves its own chapter not merely because of its commercial success, but because of the specific historical moment it arrived in and the specific condition it was positioned to treat. Panic disorder, recurrent unexpected episodes of intense fear accompanied by physical symptoms that closely mimic a heart attack, had existed for as long as humans had nervous systems, but it was not formally recognized as a diagnostic category in the American psychiatric classification system until 1980. Xanax arrived just as this diagnostic door was opening, and its maker, Upjohn, funded clinical trials specifically targeting panic disorder that were both scientifically legitimate and commercially brilliant. For people who had been having terrifying, inexplicable episodes of chest tightness and convinced they were dying, a pill that reliably stopped the panic felt like nothing short of miraculous. Xanax became associated with relief in a way that made its cultural penetration almost inevitable. The creation of the panic disorder diagnosis in the DSM-3 is itself a story worth pausing on. For years, patients who experienced panic attacks had been told they were having anxiety attacks, or heart problems, or stress responses, or nothing at all. The diagnostic category gave the experience a name, gave physicians a framework for treating it, and gave pharmaceutical companies a defined indication to target. Upjohn moved quickly. They funded a large, well-designed multi-center trial, the Cross-National Collaborative Panic Study, that demonstrated alprazolam's efficacy in panic disorder more convincingly than anything that had been done with the earlier benzodiazepines. The drug got its indication. The indication drove the prescribing drove the sales. What Xanax offered that older benzodiazepines did not was speed and intensity. Alprazolam reached peak plasma concentration faster than diazepam, produced a more sharply defined relief, and wore off more quickly, characteristics that made it exquisitely suited to the episodic nature of panic, where what you needed was something that worked right now in the middle of a panic attack, not something that created a general background of mild sedation. Patients who took Xanax for panic disorder often described the experience of a first effective dose in terms that suggested something more than pharmacology, the abrupt cessation of terror, the sudden, almost shocking normalcy. That experience was real, and for many people it was genuinely life-changing. The complications followed the same arc as the earlier benzodiazepines, but faster and more acutely. Because Xanax was shorter acting, the body's adjustment to its presence was more rapid, and the consequences of a missed dose more immediately obvious. Patients began noticing that the anxiety between doses was worse than the anxiety before they started the drug, a phenomenon called interdose withdrawal, in which the dropping plasma level of a short-acting benzodiazepine produces a rebound of the very symptoms it was prescribed to treat. The feedback loop this created, anxiety managed by the drug, anxiety worsened by the drug's absence, more drug taken to manage the worsened anxiety, was not unique to Xanax. but it was more visible with Xanax because it happened more quickly. The drug that had seemed like the most effective rescue had also become, for a significant number of patients, the thing they were being rescued from. One of the genuinely interesting things about benzodiazepines, and the thing that explains much of the clinical chaos that attended their widespread use, is that they are not interchangeable. They vary enormously in potency, in how quickly they are absorbed, in how long they stay active in the body, and in the intensity and duration of withdrawal when stopped. Triazolam, sold as Halcyon, was at the extreme end, so potent per milligram that its dosing had to be measured in fractions. Clonazepam is roughly 10 times more potent than diazepam by weight. Alprazolam falls between 2 and 4 times the potency of diazepam depending on the measure used. These differences mattered enormously for dependency and withdrawal, in ways that neither prescribers nor patients fully appreciated during the years when these drugs were being handed out like the pharmacological equivalent of a warm hug. To understand potency comparisons, it helps to anchor them to something concrete. A standard dose of diazepam for anxiety is typically between 5 and 10 milligrams. 1 milligram of lorazepam produces roughly equivalent effects. 1 milligram of alprazolam is broadly comparable to 10 milligrams of diazepam, though the timing and quality of the effect differ. Half a milligram of clonazepam is considered equivalent to 10 milligrams of diazepam in anticonvulsant effect. And triazolam, the sleeping pill that became a scandal, was prescribed at doses of 1/4 milligram, representing potency levels that required extremely careful dosing in a population that was being prescribed it largely by general practitioners rather than specialists. The clinical significance of these differences was not always communicated clearly to patients, and was sometimes not clearly understood by prescribers. A patient switched from one benzodiazepine to another, or given a different drug by a physician unfamiliar with their previous prescription, could find themselves at a very different effective dose than intended, either oversedated or, more dangerously, in unintended withdrawal. The management of benzodiazepine prescribing required a precision that the prescribing culture of the era did not consistently apply, because the prevailing assumption was that these drugs were essentially interchangeable members of a safe drug class, an assumption that the potency differences made significantly more dangerous than it seemed. What the potency question also illuminates is the dependency risk gradient across the class. All benzodiazepines carry dependency risk, but the higher potency, shorter-acting compounds, alprazolam, lorazepam, triazolam, tend to produce dependence more rapidly and withdrawal more intensely than the lower potency, longer-acting ones. This is a function both of the steeper plasma level curves and of the brain's response to sharper on-off cycling. Diazepam, paradoxically, has a somewhat more forgiving dependency profile, partly because it is gentler in its oscillations. It rises slowly, it falls slowly, and the brain has more time to adjust and readjust. The drugs that worked fastest and felt most effective were often the drugs that were hardest to stop. The benzodiazepine dependency story is one of the more uncomfortable chapters in 20th century medicine because it unfolded in slow motion, in plain sight, for approximately 2 decades before the medical establishment formally acknowledged what was happening. Physical dependence on benzodiazepines can develop within weeks of regular use, sometimes less. The mechanism is the inverse of the therapeutic effect. The same GABA receptors that were sensitized by the drug begin to downregulate in response to its constant presence, requiring increasing amounts of the drug to maintain the same effect, and producing symptoms of severe central nervous system excitation when the drug is removed. Those symptoms, insomnia, anxiety, tremors, in severe cases seizures, were often indistinguishable from the original condition being treated, which meant that what looked like a patient relapsing was frequently a patient in withdrawal, a distinction that had enormous implications for how long prescriptions were renewed. The experience of benzodiazepine dependence from the inside is not dramatic in the way that some drug dependencies are depicted. There is no particular moment when you notice it. What happens typically is gradual. The pill that used to work for the full day stops working quite as long. You find yourself thinking about the next dose a bit earlier than before. If you forget to take it, or if you are away from home without it, you notice a peculiar quality of anxiety that is somehow different from the original anxiety. More physical, more urgent, harder to distract yourself from. Your sleep is worse on nights when you have taken a dose slightly later than usual. None of this feels like addiction, in the cultural sense of that word, which is associated with craving and loss of control and dramatic escalation. It feels, instead, like the problem getting worse. That subtle presentation was clinically catastrophic, because it looked exactly like treatment failure rather than drug effect. A patient returning to their doctor with increased anxiety after months on Valium was more likely to have their dose increased than to have their medication tapered, because increased anxiety looked like the underlying condition returning, not like the medication causing a problem. The drug treated the symptom of its own absence by being present, which meant that its continued prescription appeared to be confirmed by the patient's continued need for it. The logic was circular and invisible because the frame was wrong. What patients who eventually identify their dependence describe, retrospectively, is a period of years in which they functioned, technically went to work, managed their households, maintained relationships, but in a quality of life that was subtly but pervasively diminished. Cognitive sharpness, slightly blunted, emotional range, somewhat narrowed, memory, a little unreliable, the sense of being, as many of them put it, not quite themselves, present but somehow muted, as if experiencing their own life through a film of gauze. Whether this was depression, the original anxiety, or the drug's neurological effects is often impossible to separate. They were all in there together, layered, making each other worse, and the drug was managing all of it just enough to prevent the search for a better answer. The early signals that benzodiazepines carried significant dependency risks were not absent. They were present in the literature from surprisingly early in the drug's commercial history. Reports of physical dependence following Valium discontinuation appeared in the medical literature in the late 1960s and early 70s. A British physician named Malcolm Lader was among the earliest and most persistent voices warning that long-term benzodiazepine use was producing a generation of dependent patients who would face serious difficulties if they tried to stop. His research was methodologically sound and his conclusions clear. The response from the pharmaceutical industry was swift, well-funded and effective. The evidence was contested, minimized, contextualized, and where possible ignored, in a pattern that will be recognizable to anyone who has followed the tobacco story, or the opioid story, or any of the other stories in which large financial interests have encountered inconvenient science. Malcolm Lader is a figure who deserves more prominence in the history of this era than he typically receives. A professor at the Institute of Psychiatry in London, he published some of the first brain imaging studies suggesting structural changes in the brains of long-term benzodiazepine users, changes consistent with neurological effects beyond simple sedation. His clinical observations, combined with the withdrawal studies he conducted through the late 1970s and early 80s, built a case that was difficult to dismiss on scientific grounds and was therefore dismissed on other grounds. His sample sizes were small, his methods were questioned, his conclusions were said to be premature. The response was not dishonest exactly. Science legitimately requires replication and caution, but the energy invested in the challenges was not proportional to the scientific uncertainty. It was proportional to the commercial stakes. The difficulty for physicians receiving the conflicting signals was genuine. You had on one side the Roche-sponsored literature, substantial in volume and consistently reassuring. On the other, a smaller body of research suggesting serious long-term concerns, often from researchers who were not particularly prominent in the clinical mainstream. The principle of primum non nocere, first, do no harm, might have argued for caution in the face of uncertainty. The practical demands of clinical practice, the patients in the waiting room who needed help, and the availability of a drug that worked, pushed in the other direction. Most doctors, confronted with this situation, continued prescribing. They were not villains. They were people operating within a system that was not giving them accurate information and was under no regulatory compulsion to do so. The lesson the benzodiazepine warning episode teaches, and it is a lesson that has been available for 40 years without being fully learned, is that the absence of long-term safety data at the time of a drug's approval is not the same as evidence of long-term safety. Librium and Valium were approved on the basis of clinical trials lasting weeks to months. The conditions for which they were prescribed lasted years to decades. The gap between the evidence base and the duration of use was the space in which the dependency crisis developed, invisible to regulators and prescribers until it was very, very large. If the United States was the birthplace of benzodiazepine culture, Britain ran it a close second, and in some ways produced the clearest documentation of where it led. Prescribing rates in the United Kingdom through the 1970s were extraordinary, concentrated heavily among older women, and administered largely by general practitioners who had neither the time nor the training to manage the long-term consequences. By the early 1980s, British researchers were publishing studies showing that hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, of patients had developed significant physical dependence, with some having taken the same benzodiazepine prescription daily for 5, 10, 15 years. Support groups began forming, parliamentary inquiries began, the term benzo survivors entered the vocabulary. Britain became, in the history of these drugs, something like the canary in the coal mine, visible evidence of what happened when the prescribing ran ahead of the science. The Committee on Safety of Medicines in the United Kingdom issued its first formal warning about benzodiazepine dependence in 1980, recommending that prescriptions be limited to short-term use. This was earlier and more decisive than comparable regulatory action in the United States, partly because the British research community had been more focused on the problem, and partly because the National Health Service, as a single-payer system, had better visibility into prescribing patterns than the fragmented American system. When the data showed that a significant proportion of long-term benzodiazepine users were elderly women who had been on the same prescription for years without review, the systemic nature of the problem was impossible to ignore. The British support groups that formed in the early 1980s, organisations like Tranx and the Council for Involuntary Tranquilizer Addiction, became important not only as support networks, but as political actors, bringing patient testimony into public debate in ways that clinical researchers alone could not. Their members were largely middle-aged and older women who had been prescribed benzodiazepines for anxiety or insomnia in the 1970s and who, when they or their doctors attempted to discontinue the medication, discovered that the process was far more difficult and the symptoms far more severe than anyone had prepared them for. Their accounts were detailed, credible, and consistent in ways that made them hard to dismiss as the complaints of a small minority. The British experience also illustrated something important about the social geography of benzodiazepine dependence. It was not concentrated in populations associated with recreational drug use or addiction, in the cultural sense of those terms. It was distributed across the most ordinary cross-sections of society. Retired teachers, working mothers, small business owners, people with no history of substance problems and no intention of developing one. The dependents had arrived through the front door of a GP's surgery on a printed prescription, dispensed by a pharmacist taken as directed. This made it, in some ways, harder for the medical establishment to respond to, because the framing of addiction did not fit, and without that framing the standard responses were not available. The regulatory response to benzodiazepine dependence was, in the American context, a slow-building crescendo rather than a sudden intervention. The FDA began requesting updated labelling to reflect dependency risks in the 1970s, and warnings were added, but they were written in the careful, minimising language that tends to characterise pharmaceutical labelling, at the point where commercial interests and scientific evidence are in active negotiation. The real shift came in the 1980s, when congressional hearings on benzodiazepine prescribing patterns provided a public forum for what researchers had been saying in the journals. Senator Edward Kennedy, himself a long-time Valium user who had publicly acknowledged dependency, held hearings in 1979 that produced significant press coverage and genuine public alarm. The prescribing patterns began to shift, though not as dramatically or as quickly as the data might have suggested they should. The Kennedy hearings were remarkable as political theatre and as a document of what regulatory attention looks like when it finally arrives. Senator Kennedy's personal experience with Valium gave him a credibility in that room that no external critic could have had, and the testimony that followed from physicians, researchers, patients, and pharmaceutical executives laid out in public the full contours of a problem that had been developing for nearly 2 decades. Roche's representatives maintained that the drug was safe when used as directed, that dependence was primarily a problem of misuse, and that the evidence for widespread harm was overstated. The researchers who testified told a different story, backed by data that was harder to dismiss in a congressional hearing than it had been in the pages of a medical journal. The labelling changes that followed the hearings were real, but limited in their practical effect. Warning labels inform. They do not change prescribing cultures. Physicians who had been prescribing long-term benzodiazepines to their patients for years did not, upon seeing a new warning label, immediately change their approach, because the label did not change their relationship with their patients, or their clinical habits, or the pharmaceutical representatives they continued to see. Institutional inertia in medicine is profound, and the inertia of a prescribing practice that was helping people in the short term, that patients were actively requesting, that was producing no obvious harm in the examination room, was not easily overcome by a warning in small print. What the regulatory attention did accomplish, in the longer arc, was a shift in the cultural and clinical framing of benzodiazepines that would eventually, over decades, change prescribing patterns in measurable ways. The drugs moved, gradually, from something prescribed casually to something prescribed with at least nominal awareness of risks, and at least nominal intention of short-term use. That shift was incomplete, inconsistently applied, and came too late for a generation of patients who had already developed dependence. But it began in those congressional hearing rooms in 1979, with a senator talking about his own experience with a small yellow pill. Among the more dramatic episodes in the benzodiazepine story is the saga of triazolam, marketed under the brand name Halcyon, which became in the early 1990s a genuine international controversy. Triazolam was an extremely short-acting, extremely potent benzodiazepine used primarily as a sleeping pill, and its side effect profile, particularly at higher doses, included a phenomenon called anterograde amnesia, meaning users could carry on entire conversations, make decisions, and engage with the world without forming any memories of having done so. Reports of bizarre nocturnal behaviour, of people doing things in a halcyon-induced state they had no recollection of, accumulated through the late 1980s. When a researcher in the Netherlands named Cees van der Kroef began documenting what he considered suppressed safety data in Upjohn's clinical trials, the story went global. Britain withdrew Halcyon entirely in 1991. The FDA kept it on the market with additional warnings. The argument about whether that was the right call continues in some quarters to this day. The amnesia reports surrounding Halcyon range from the mildly unsettling to the genuinely alarming. There were people who had taken Halcyon and subsequently driven cars with no memory of having done so. There were people who had made phone calls they could not recall. There were people who had engaged in complex activities, preparing food, writing letters, having arguments, in a state of complete pharmacological amnesia. These were not rare or isolated reports. They accumulated in the published literature and in spontaneous case reports to the FDA at rates that were difficult to attribute to chance. The mechanism was well understood. Triazolam's very short half-life produced a rapid decline in plasma levels during the night, and the rapid oscillation between high and low drug levels was associated with a particularly pronounced amnesiac effect. Upjohn's response to the accumulating evidence followed a now familiar pattern. The reports were disputed. The methodology of critical studies was challenged. and the benefits of the drug were emphasized against the risks. The regulatory divergence between Britain, which removed the drug, and the United States, which kept it with enhanced warnings, became a case study in how different regulatory philosophies and different political contexts produce different outcomes from the same scientific evidence. The British decision was criticised in the United States as an overreaction driven by media pressure rather than sound science. The American decision was criticised in Britain as regulatory capture by pharmaceutical interests. Neither charge was entirely wrong. What the halcyon story added to the broader benzodiazepine narrative was a new dimension of concern. It was not just about dependence and withdrawal. It was about what these drugs could do to a person's experience of reality in the period of their action. The amnesia produced by halcyon was, in its extreme form, a total disconnection between action and memory, a state in which a person could function outwardly while being, in any meaningful psychological sense, absent. That the sleeping pill you took for insomnia could produce this state was a category of concern that the standard dependency conversation had not encompassed. It suggested that the relationship between benzodiazepines and consciousness was more complicated than the marketing had ever acknowledged. One of the more philosophically interesting properties of benzodiazepines is their effect on memory formation. Specifically, the formation of new memories in the period following a dose is. The anterograde amnesia that made halcyon infamous, but that is present to some degree across the entire class. This is why benzodiazepines are used in procedural sedation for medical and dental procedures. Patients remain conscious, can follow instructions, but frequently retain little or no memory of the event afterward. In therapeutic anxiety treatment, this property was sometimes considered a feature E. If you don't remember the anxious thought, perhaps you are less attached to it. In practice, the memory effects complicated patients' lives in ways that were difficult to quantify, contributing to that subtle, hard-to-articulate sense that one's mental life was somehow less vivid, less retrievable, less one's own. The mechanism of benzodiazepine-induced amnesia connects back to the hippocampus, the brain structure most directly involved in transferring experiences from short-term to long-term storage. GABA receptors in the hippocampus are involved in the cellular processes that consolidate memories, the synaptic changes that turn a moment of experience into a retrievable record. Benzodiazepines, by enhancing GABA activity, interfere with this consolidation process. The experience happens, but it does not stick. You are present for it in the sense that your eyes are open and your body is functioning, but the recording equipment is impaired. For patients on long-term benzodiazepines, this impairment was often experienced not as discrete memory blackouts, but as a general fogginess, a sense that things were less sharp, less distinct, less available for later retrieval. People describe difficulty with names and details, a feeling of increased forgetfulness, an impression that the texture of their mental life was somehow flattened. These complaints were often dismissed as depression, as aging, as the original anxiety disorder. They were real, and they had a pharmacological basis, and they were reversible upon discontinuation, though the process of reversal was sometimes slow enough, measured in months, that patients were not always certain the clarity would return. The use of benzodiazepines in procedural sedation remains entirely justified and clinically valuable precisely because the amnesia is a feature, not a bug. Patients undergoing colonoscopies or dental surgery prefer not to remember the experience, and the ability to provide that merciful gap in the record is genuinely useful. The irony is that the same property deployed therapeutically in a clinical procedure is the same property that, in chronic daily use for anxiety, was quietly erasing pieces of people's lives. The drug did not distinguish between the memory you wanted to keep and the memory you would rather forget. It simplified the problem by erasing them indiscriminately. The relationship between benzodiazepines and alcohol is pharmacologically intimate and clinically significant. Both are central nervous system depressants. both enhance GABA activity. Taken together, their effects are not simply additive but synergistic. The combination produces sedation, respiratory depression, and impaired coordination at dose levels that either drug alone would not cause. This is not obscure knowledge. It was understood from the earliest days of benzodiazepine use, and it appeared in every prescribing warning. It was also, in practice, extremely common. People who were prescribed Valium for anxiety were often also people who drank socially, or who drank to manage anxiety before the prescription arrived, or who drank because the Valium was no longer working as well as it once had. The combination accounted for a significant proportion of emergency room visits and overdose deaths across the decades of peak benzodiazepine use, a statistic that existed quietly alongside the commercial success stories. The reasons this combination was so common are not difficult to understand, even if the consequences were difficult to manage. Anxiety and alcohol use have a deeply entangled epidemiology. People with anxiety disorders drink more than the general population, partly because alcohol is a fast-acting, socially available anxiolytic that works through some of the same mechanisms as benzodiazepines, which is to say it works through GABA. Someone who has been managing anxiety with 2 glasses of wine each evening and then receives a Valium prescription has not necessarily been told that the combination of those 2 evening rituals carries risk. The prescribing conversation of the 1970s often did not reach that level of detail. The dangers compound rapidly. A moderate drinker taking a therapeutic dose of Valium is at meaningfully higher risk of respiratory depression than a non-drinker at the same dose, because both drugs are suppressing the same systems, and the suppressions add together in non-linear ways. The dose of either drug that would be safe in isolation becomes potentially dangerous in combination, and the dose of both that would be dangerous is lower than most people's intuitions would suggest. Emergency medicine physicians in the era of peak benzodiazepine prescribing saw this combination frequently enough that it became a standard part of the overdose differential, a pattern that looked like suicide and sometimes was, but sometimes was not. Sometimes it was just 2 drugs, taken separately for separate reasons, meeting in a body that had not been told they should not be introduced. The chronic use interaction is in some ways even more insidious than the acute overdose risk. Long-term simultaneous use of alcohol and benzodiazepines produces compounding neurological effects, cross-tolerance, and a combined withdrawal that is potentially more severe and more dangerous than either drug's withdrawal alone. Patients who were dependent on both and who attempted to discontinue either faced a clinical situation that required specialist management and that was not always managed at the level of the general practice. The comorbidity, invisible in the standard prescribing record, carried consequences that were measured not in statistics, but in individual lives navigating the worst of both. If taking benzodiazepines is, at therapeutic doses, an experience of profound neurological calm, stopping them after long-term use can be the pharmacological equivalent of trying to stop a freight train by stepping in front of it. Benzodiazepine withdrawal syndrome is among the most medically serious of drug withdrawal processes, comparable in severity to alcohol withdrawal, and capable, in abrupt discontinuation, after high-dose long-term use, of producing life-threatening seizures. The recommended method of discontinuation, a very slow, gradual taper over months or sometimes years, depending on the duration and dose of use, requires patience, medical supervision, and a tolerance for protracted discomfort that most people find genuinely challenging. A condition called protracted withdrawal syndrome, in which anxiety, insomnia, and cognitive symptoms persist for months or years after discontinuation, is documented in the literature and debated in its scope, but real for the people experiencing it. The seizure risk is not theoretical or rare. The neurological changes that occur with long-term benzodiazepine use, the downregulation of GABA receptors, the compensatory upregulation of excitatory systems, leave the brain in a state of suppressed excitability that is maintained by the drug. Remove the drug abruptly, and the excitatory systems, no longer opposed by the artificially enhanced GABA activity, fire unchecked. In severe cases, this unchecked excitation produces seizures. This is physiologically identical to what happens in severe alcohol withdrawal, which is why both conditions are managed with the same drug class, and why neither should be stopped abruptly without medical guidance. People have died from cold turkey benzodiazepine withdrawal after long-term use. It is not the same as caffeine withdrawal. It is not managed by willpower. The taper protocol that most specialists recommend is, by the standards of most medical treatment, extraordinarily slow. A patient who has been on a significant dose of a short-acting benzodiazepine for several years may be advised to taper over 12 to 24 months, reducing the dose by small increments at intervals measured in weeks. The conversion to diazepam, a long-acting benzodiazepine used as a tapering vehicle because of its smoother pharmacological profile, is a standard step that adds complexity and requires clinical knowledge that not all general practitioners possess. The patient undertaking this process is simultaneously managing the symptoms of withdrawal, the return of the anxiety for which the drug was originally prescribed, and the demands of ordinary life, often without the full support of a healthcare system that was designed around acute care rather than months-long taper management. What protracted withdrawal syndrome describes, the symptoms that persist beyond the acute phase, sometimes for a year or more, is perhaps the most contested territory in the entire benzodiazepine literature. That some patients experience prolonged symptoms after discontinuation is not seriously disputed. The mechanism, the prevalence, and the appropriate clinical response remain areas of ongoing research and occasional heated disagreement. What is clear is that for people who experience it, the syndrome is real and disabling, and that the standard medical response of skepticism, or reassurance that what they are experiencing cannot be the drug, has been one of the more consistent cruelties in the long history of the benzodiazepine era. Into the gap between what the medical establishment was offering benzodiazepine-dependent patients and what those patients actually needed, stepped a British clinical pharmacologist named Heather Ashton, who spent 2 decades running a benzodiazepine withdrawal clinic at the University of Newcastle, and who, in 2000, published what became known simply as the Ashton Manual, a detailed, compassionate, practically oriented guide to tapering off benzodiazepines that was distributed freely online and became, for tens of thousands of people navigating withdrawal without adequate medical support, something close to a lifeline. The manual was not a peer-reviewed clinical trial. It was the distillation of one physician's long clinical experience, written for patients, in language patients could understand. It was also, in many quarters, more useful than anything the healthcare system was offering, which is itself a fairly pointed commentary on the healthcare system. Heather Ashton died in 2019, and the obituaries noted her clinical contribution with appropriate respect. But the fuller picture of what she represented in the lives of the patients who found her work is harder to capture in standard professional terms. She began her clinical work with benzodiazepine-dependent patients in the early 1980s, at precisely the moment when the British medical establishment was beginning to acknowledge the scale of the problem, but before it had developed anything like adequate clinical infrastructure for managing it. She ran withdrawal support groups, developed individualized taper schedules, and paid meticulous attention to the symptom patterns that patients described, not dismissing them, not reframing them as psychiatric disorder, but treating them as the neurological phenomena they were. The manual that grew out of this work is a remarkable document. It begins with a clear-eyed explanation of benzodiazepine pharmacology and what happens physiologically during long-term use and withdrawal. It provides specific taper schedules for each drug in the class, calibrated by dose and duration of use. It lists the symptoms that patients might experience and explains their mechanisms. It addresses the question of protracted withdrawal with neither alarm nor dismissal. It tells patients that they can recover and that the timeline is individual and that the pace of the taper is theirs to set. The tone throughout is that of a physician who has sat across from thousands of suffering people and has made the clinical and moral decision to take their experience seriously. The distribution of the Ashton Manual through early internet forums and later through dedicated websites represents one of the more interesting examples of patient-driven health information closing a gap that the healthcare system had left open. People who had been told by their doctors that their withdrawal symptoms were imaginary, or were the return of the original anxiety, or were not related to the medication, found in the manual a clinical validation of their experience and a practical framework for managing it. Its limitations, it is the work of one clinician, not a systematic review, just are real, and Ashton herself was careful to describe it as a guide rather than a protocol. But in the absence of anything better, for a population that needed something, it was and remains something. For all the complexity surrounding their long-term use, it would be a serious mistake to leave the clinical utility of benzodiazepines unacknowledged, because in certain contexts these drugs remain genuinely, undeniably, sometimes dramatically life-saving. Alcohol withdrawal seizures can be fatal, and benzodiazepines are the first-line treatment for preventing them. Status epilepticus, continuous seizure activity that, if untreated, causes irreversible brain damage, is broken by intravenous benzodiazepines in hospital emergency settings with a reliability and speed that no other class of drugs has matched. Procedural anxiety in medical and dental settings is managed safely and effectively with short-acting benzodiazepines. Acute panic disorder episodes, in the moment of their occurrence, respond to benzodiazepines in ways that allow the person experiencing them to function. The drugs are not evil. They are powerful. Those are different things. The management of alcohol withdrawal illustrates this particularly well. Severe alcohol withdrawal syndrome, characterized by tremors, hallucinations, agitation, and in its most dangerous form, the seizures and cardiovascular instability of delirium tremens, was, before the benzodiazepine era, managed with barbiturates or paraldehyde, drugs that were effective but carried their own serious risks. The introduction of benzodiazepines, particularly the longer-acting ones like chlordiazepoxide and diazepam, gave clinicians a treatment that reliably suppressed the excitatory rebound of alcohol withdrawal while carrying a wide enough safety margin to be administered in general hospital settings rather than only in intensive care. Withdrawal mortality rates declined, patient comfort improved, the management of alcohol dependence became, if not simple, at least more reliably survivable. Status epilepticus is the other domain where benzodiazepine efficacy is not a matter of serious debate. A seizure that does not stop on its own within 5 minutes is a medical emergency with serious neurological consequences. Intravenous or intramuscular lorazepam, or more recently intranasal or buccal midazolam, in out-of-hospital settings, terminates active seizures in the majority of cases within minutes. There is no class of drugs that does this as reliably, as quickly, and as safely as the benzodiazepines. The emergency physician reaching for lorazepam in the resuscitation bay is not weighing the long-term dependency risks, because in that moment the long-term dependency risks are not the relevant consideration. The relevant consideration is whether the seizure stops. It stops. This complexity, that the same class of drugs can be life-saving in one context and harmful in another, is not a paradox that requires resolution so much as a fact that requires careful clinical thought. Drugs are not good or bad in the abstract. They are appropriate or inappropriate for specific patients in specific situations for specific durations. The history of benzodiazepines is, among other things, a history of what happens when a drug whose appropriate use is narrow and time-limited is applied broadly and indefinitely, and what it costs when the institutions that should maintain that distinction stop maintaining it. The arc of benzodiazepine prescribing bends toward decline in the 1990s, and the force most responsible for bending it is the rise of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, which began with fluoxetine, better known as Prozac, in 1988. SSRIs operate on a completely different neurotransmitter system. carry no physical dependence in the benzodiazepine sense, and were positioned explicitly as the new, safer answer to anxiety and depression. The marketing around Prozac and the SSRIs that followed was, if anything, more culturally ambitious than the Valium marketing of the previous generation, extending to the argument that these drugs did not just treat illness, but restored a true self that anxiety and depression had obscured. Benzodiazepines did not disappear from the pharmacopoeia, but they moved, at least in the official rhetoric of psychiatry, from first-line treatment to adjunctive short-term support while the SSRI took hold. Prozac's cultural impact in the early 1990s was, if anything, more dramatic than Valium's had been in the 1960s, which is saying something. Peter Kramer's 1993 book, Listening to Prozac, introduced the general reading public to the concept of cosmetic psychopharmacology. The idea that these drugs might do more than treat illness, that they might enhance normal functioning, that the distinction between treating disease and improving the well person was less clear than previously assumed. This was a significant conceptual expansion, and not a purely theoretical one. The SSRI prescribing culture of the 1990s developed its own version of the diagnostic expansion that had characterized the Valium era, the gradual broadening of the indicated populations, the lowering of the threshold for treatment, the pharmaceutical marketing that found anxiety and depression in an ever wider cross-section of ordinary human difficulty. The comparison between benzodiazepines and SSRIs for anxiety is more nuanced than the 1990s narrative suggested. SSRIs are generally slower to produce effect. They require weeks of consistent use before anxiety reduction becomes apparent, compared to the near immediate action of benzodiazepines. For acute or situational anxiety, this made them genuinely inferior. For chronic generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety, and panic disorder, the long-term evidence supporting SSRIs is solid. Their tolerability profile is generally better than benzodiazepines, and their discontinuation profile, while not without complications, is less medically serious. The clinical case for moving first-line anxiety treatment to SSRIs was legitimate. What the SSRI era did not do was solve the benzodiazepine problem that had already accumulated. The millions of patients already dependent on benzodiazepines when Prozac arrived did not simply transfer to the new drug class. Many of them continued on benzodiazepines, now increasingly as an add-on to an SSRI, rather than as monotherapy, the combination becoming its own clinical challenge. And a new generation of anxiety sufferers, initiated on SSRIs but finding them insufficient for acute symptom control, received benzodiazepines as bridge treatment that in a subset of cases never got the bridge removed. The crisis of long-term prescribing did not end with Prozac. It evolved. The story of benzodiazepines is not only a story of prescription pads and clinical guidelines. It is also, particularly from the 1990s onward, a story of diversion, of prescription drugs finding their way into informal markets, used by people who had no prescription, often in combination with other substances, and in doses and contexts that bore no relationship to the careful titration of the clinical setting. Benzodiazepines became, in the landscape of illicit drug use, what is sometimes called a downer, a drug used to modulate the effects of stimulants, to ease opiate withdrawal, or simply because the calming effect was something a person wanted and the pill was available. The street Xanax market expanded substantially in the opioid epidemic era, and the emergence of counterfeit benzodiazepine pills, often pressed with fentanyl or other synthetic opioids, added a lethal dimension to a problem that had begun, several decades earlier, as a story about nervous housewives and overworked general practitioners. The mechanisms of diversion are worth understanding because they illuminate how pharmaceuticals move between the regulated and unregulated economies. The most common routes have always been relatively prosaic. Patients who receive more medication than they use, patients who exaggerate symptoms to obtain prescriptions for drugs they intend to sell, prescription forgery, pharmacy theft, and the cascading secondary market that begins when any of these sources meet someone willing to pay. The legal penalty structure and the ease of concealment made benzodiazepines attractive compared to heavier drugs. They were small, valuable, and carried a certain legitimacy that came from being prescription drugs. They looked like medicine, because they were medicine, a blurring that complicated both their cultural meaning and their legal management. The use of benzodiazepines among people who also use opioids was understood as a harm reduction problem from early in the opioid epidemic. People in opioid withdrawal use benzodiazepines to manage the physical symptoms that opioids suppress: anxiety, insomnia, restlessness. People using opioids recreationally combine benzodiazepines to modulate or intensify the effect. The combination that emergency physicians see in the overdose setting is often this one: opioid plus benzodiazepine, the respiratory depression of both drugs summing to a level that the body cannot maintain. When counterfeit Xanax bars began appearing in the illicit market, tablets pressed in clandestine facilities to resemble the pharmaceutical product, and the pills were found to contain fentanyl rather than alprazolam, the overdose deaths that followed were deaths involving a product that looked exactly like a medication but was not. The original marketing of Xanax, which had normalized the pill's appearance in the culture over 3 decades, had contributed in some abstract but real sense to the conditions that made those counterfeit tablets so easy to distribute without immediate suspicion. The intersection of benzodiazepines and the opioid crisis is one of the most consequential pharmacological stories of the early 21st century. Data published in the second decade of this century showed that a significant proportion of opioid overdose deaths involved benzodiazepines as a co-ingestant. The combination of central nervous system depression from both drug classes, producing respiratory failure at doses that neither drug alone would have caused. The FDA issued a black box warning in 2016 about the combination, its highest level of regulatory alert. Prescribing guidelines were updated, insurance formularies were restructured, and yet the co-prescribing of opioids and benzodiazepines, while reduced from its peak, continued at levels that many pharmacologists considered clinically indefensible, a durable example of the lag between what the data says and what the prescribing population does. The numbers behind this intersection were large enough to constitute a public health crisis within a public health crisis. Studies published in the early 2010s found that approximately 30% of opioid overdose deaths in the United States involved concomitant benzodiazepine use. That was not a marginal contribution. It meant that a drug prescribed for anxiety was, through a mechanism that was pharmacologically clear and well understood, a significant multiplier of lethality for people who were simultaneously prescribed pain management. Many of the patients in that overlap were not abusing either drug. They were taking both as prescribed by physicians who in many cases did not know, or did not communicate, that the combination created a risk profile substantially different from either drug alone. The pharmacological mechanism of the interaction is worth understanding in concrete terms, because it is not complicated and its simplicity makes the failure to manage it more striking. Both opioids and benzodiazepines suppress activity in the central nervous system, but through different pathways. Opioids bind to receptors in the brainstem that regulate breathing, slowing respiratory rate, and reducing the drive to breathe in response to rising carbon dioxide. Benzodiazepines, through their GABA-enhancing mechanism, produce additional suppression of the same brainstem systems. When both are present simultaneously, the combined suppression can reduce respiratory drive to a level the body cannot maintain, particularly during sleep, when the conscious effort that partially compensates for drug-induced suppression is absent. The person goes to sleep and simply does not breathe adequately. Carbon dioxide rises. Without the normal protective arousal response, which the drugs have also suppressed, the person does not wake up. This mechanism was not unknown to the medical community in the years when co-prescribing was at its height. It appeared in pharmacology textbooks. It was described in the prescribing information for both drug classes. It was the subject of published warnings and clinical guidelines. The failure to translate this knowledge into prescribing behavior across the system was therefore not a failure of science, but a failure of implementation. of the structures that should carry scientific knowledge from the journal and the guideline into the examining room and the prescription pad. Understanding why that implementation failed requires looking at the incentive structures, the time pressures, and the communication gaps of a fragmented healthcare system where the physician prescribing alprazolam for anxiety was frequently not the same physician prescribing oxycodone for back pain, and where the two prescriptions existed in separate records in separate practices without a systematic mechanism for reconciliation. The FDA black box warning of 2016 was the most visible regulatory response, requiring both opioid and benzodiazepine prescriptions to carry explicit language about the risks of co-administration. Black box warnings are the most prominent warnings in pharmaceutical labeling and are reserved for serious risks. Their effect on prescribing behavior has historically been modest, visible enough to provide regulatory documentation that action was taken, not always sufficient to change what happens in the examining room. The subsequent restructuring of insurance formularies, in which many payers implemented systems that flagged or required prior authorization for concurrent opioid and benzodiazepine prescriptions, was arguably a more effective intervention because it introduced friction into a prescribing path that had previously been frictionless. When a physician has to make an affirmative case for why a patient needs both drugs simultaneously, the cases that cannot survive that scrutiny tend not to be made. The data following these interventions showed measurable decline in co-prescribing rates, which is the clearest available evidence that the interventions were working in at least the narrow sense of changing the behavior they targeted. Whether they were working in the broader sense, whether the patients who were no longer receiving both prescriptions were receiving adequate alternative management for the conditions that had prompted the prescriptions, is a more difficult question, and one that the outcome data do not fully answer. Some patients who lost access to concurrent prescriptions found alternative management. Others fell through the gaps of a healthcare system that had removed a treatment without replacing it. The story of benzodiazepines and the opioid epidemic is also, inevitably, a story about social geography. The overdose deaths involving the combination were not evenly distributed across the population. They were concentrated in the same communities, rural, post-industrial, economically precarious, where opioid prescribing had been highest, and where healthcare infrastructure was most attenuated. These were places where the prescribing had gone deepest, where the monitoring had been lightest, and where the alternatives to pharmaceutical management of pain and anxiety were scarcest. The pharmacological interaction killed people everywhere it occurred, but the conditions that made its occurrence most likely were conditions of poverty, isolation, and inadequate care. Conditions that the black box warning did not address, and that formulary restrictions alone could not resolve. What the intersection of benzodiazepines and opioids ultimately illustrates, as a policy matter, is the challenge of managing risk in a system where the same patient's care is distributed across multiple prescribers who do not always communicate with one another, in a regulatory environment where the approval of each drug is considered separately from its interaction with every other drug the patient might be taking. The physician prescribing Xanax for anxiety was not necessarily the same physician prescribing oxycodone for back pain, and in the absence of complete medication reconciliation, the deadly combination could be constructed entirely within the regulated healthcare system, from legitimate prescriptions, by patients following their doctor's instructions exactly as given. That this was possible, that a person could die from a combination of drugs they received legally, from physicians who were each following standard practice, is perhaps the most important systemic fact in the entire history of these drugs. The story of benzodiazepines in the 21st century has a new chapter that the original researchers could not have anticipated. The emergence of novel designer benzodiazepines, synthesized outside the regulated pharmaceutical system, sold online, and existing in a legal grey zone that makes them difficult to track, schedule, or control. Drugs like alprazolam, flualprazolam, and clonazepam share the basic benzodiazepine pharmacology, GABA enhancement, sedation, dependency potential, but were not covered by the original scheduling of the classic drugs, allowing them to be sold briefly as research chemicals before regulatory agencies caught up. Some are significantly more potent than the pharmaceutical originals. None have been through anything resembling the clinical safety evaluation that a drug requires before entering a medical system. And because their users are largely self-medicating outside any clinical context, the harms they cause are systematically undercounted. The research chemical market that produced the novel benzodiazepines is itself a product of several converging forces. The internet's capacity to connect buyers and sellers across jurisdictions, the chemistry knowledge that became widely available through academic publications and online forums, and the regulatory framework for controlled substances that could only schedule compounds after they were identified and characterized. A perpetually reactive process in a field where new compounds could be synthesized faster than they could be scheduled. The cat-and-mouse dynamic between chemists producing novel psychoactive substances and regulators trying to restrict them has produced, over the past 2 decades, an extraordinary proliferation of compounds across multiple drug classes, of which the designer benzodiazepines are one of the more pharmacologically predictable examples. Alprazolam is the most widely studied of the novel benzodiazepines, partly because it has legitimate pharmaceutical status in Japan and several other Asian countries, giving it a clinical literature that most designer compounds lack. It is a thienodiazepine, structurally related to but chemically distinct from the classic benzodiazepines, with anxiolytic and sedative properties broadly similar to its pharmaceutical cousins, and a dependency profile that the limited available data suggest is at least as significant. In Western countries, it has been sold as a research chemical, as a supplement, and through online pharmacies operating in regulatory gaps, to a population that includes people with anxiety disorders unable to access conventional care, people who have lost access to benzodiazepine prescriptions, and people with recreational drug use patterns who want a sedative that is not yet scheduled. The users of these compounds are not a demographically uniform group, and understanding who is using them and why is important to understanding both the harm profile and the potential responses. A significant portion of the designer benzodiazepine user population consists of people who were previously prescribed pharmaceutical benzodiazepines and who, following the tightening of prescribing guidelines, found their prescriptions reduced or discontinued without adequate support for withdrawal or alternative management. These are people who are dependent on a drug class and are seeking the drug class because the managed healthcare pathway to it has been closed. The harm they experience from designer benzodiazepines is, in a real sense, a downstream consequence of the prescribing policies that were themselves responses to the harms of the pharmaceutical era. The problem has not been solved, it has been displaced. Another significant portion consists of people self-medicating anxiety or insomnia who have never had a prescription and who prefer to obtain their medication through informal channels rather than navigate a healthcare system they find inaccessible, stigmatizing, or expensive. The barrier to access that this population faces is genuine, and the existence of unregulated alternatives that are pharmacologically effective, at least in the short term, represents an adaptation to a gap in the formal care system. The problem with this adaptation is not that the drugs fail to work, it is that they work through the same mechanisms as the pharmaceutical versions, carry the same dependency risks, and are obtained without any of the monitoring, dose calibration, or clinical support that even imperfectly managed pharmaceutical prescribing provides. The harm reduction challenge posed by designer benzodiazepines is significant precisely because the absence of pharmaceutical standardization means that potency is inconsistent in ways that create overdose risk, even at what a user believes to be a safe dose. A tablet sold as containing 1 milligram of a novel compound may contain significantly more or significantly less, or may contain a different compound entirely if the production process is careless or intentionally deceptive. The user has no basis for reliable dose estimation of the kind that pharmaceutical tablets, whatever their other problems, at least provide. Drug checking services, organizations that allow people to submit substances for chemical analysis, have identified numerous cases in which designer benzodiazepine products contain different compounds than labeled at different concentrations, sometimes in combination with other drugs not disclosed in the product description. The regulatory response to novel psychoactive substances, including designer benzodiazepines, has varied across jurisdictions and has been broadly unsatisfying in its outcomes. Blanket scheduling of entire structural classes, an approach adopted in some countries, reduces the window of legal availability for each new compound but does not stop production. It simply redirects it to the next slight structural modification that falls outside the scheduled class. Emergency scheduling of specific compounds, the approach favoured in the United States, is more targeted but slower, and depends on regulatory agencies having identified the specific compound, characterised it, and moved through the administrative process before its market window closes. Neither approach addresses the underlying demand, which is a population with anxiety, without adequate care, and with internet access. The future of this problem is shaped by the future of anxiety care access more broadly. Designer benzodiazepines are not primarily a chemistry problem or a law enforcement problem. They are a healthcare problem, specifically the problem of what happens when a significant population needs treatment for a genuine medical condition and cannot access it through the formal system. Until that access problem is solved, the informal market will continue to provide what the formal system does not, in whatever pharmacological form is currently not yet scheduled, at whatever dose the tablet press happened to produce, without a physician, without monitoring, and without a safety net. One of the quieter and more important stories embedded within the larger benzodiazepine narrative is the story of the patients who found themselves profoundly unwell after stopping these drugs and who, for years and in some cases decades, were told by their doctors that what they were experiencing was not real, or was not related to the medication, or was simply the return of the underlying anxiety the drug had been masking. Online forums dedicated to benzodiazepine withdrawal began forming in the early internet era and grew into substantial communities of people sharing their experiences, comparing tapering schedules, and providing mutual support in the absence of adequate medical guidance. The existence of these communities is, among other things, evidence of a healthcare failure, of a gap between what the clinical system knew, what it was willing to acknowledge, and what people needed. The experience of not being believed by a physician about a medication's effects is, in general, a significant source of medical harm. It delays appropriate treatment, it damages the therapeutic relationship, and it produces a secondary suffering. The suffering of having one's perception of one's own body contradicted by someone with institutional authority, that compounds the primary suffering in ways that are difficult to fully account for. For benzodiazepine withdrawal patients specifically, this experience was widespread enough to constitute a pattern, and the pattern was not accidental. It derived from the same source as the original prescribing culture, a framework in which the drugs were understood to be safe, in which the possibility of serious protracted effects was not part of the clinical training, and in which symptoms that could be attributed to the underlying anxiety disorder were attributed to it rather than to the medication. The symptom picture of protracted benzodiazepine withdrawal is broad and variable enough that its misattribution to other conditions is pharmacologically understandable, even if clinically inadequate. Patients describe anxiety, insomnia, cognitive impairment, sensory disturbances, tinnitus, photosensitivity, paresthesias, muscle pain, fatigue, and mood disturbance persisting for months after the last dose of the drug. This constellation of symptoms does not map onto any single recognized condition, and in the absence of a clear clinical framework for recognizing it, the default attribution to the underlying psychiatric diagnosis is predictable. The patient who reports worsened anxiety after stopping Valium is most easily understood as a patient whose anxiety has returned. That the worsened anxiety might be a direct neurological consequence of the drug's absence, representing a brain that has been pharmacologically reorganized and is struggling to re-establish its baseline, requires a clinical framework that many practitioners still do not have. The online communities that formed around benzodiazepine withdrawal, forums like Benzo Buddies and its predecessors, Facebook groups, Reddit communities, became repositories of detailed, granular, mutually validated clinical information that in some respects exceeded what was available in the clinical literature. Members shared taper schedules with a specificity that was the product of collective experience with a population far larger than any single clinician's practice. Hold times between dose reductions, symptoms experienced at each stage, management strategies for specific symptom clusters, the relationship between taper pace and symptom severity. The quality of information was uneven, and the absence of medical oversight meant that occasionally harmful advice circulated alongside good guidance. But the overall function of these communities, providing validation, practical information, and the simple but profound reassurance that others had experienced the same thing and recovered, filled a gap that the healthcare system had left open. The validation function deserves particular emphasis because it addressed a harm that was itself a product of the healthcare system's failure. A person in protracted withdrawal who's been told repeatedly by physicians that their symptoms are psychological, that the drug has been out of their system for months and cannot be causing what they describe, who's been offered increased psychiatric medication rather than recognition of a physiological syndrome. That person arrives at an online community carrying not only the symptoms of withdrawal, but the additional burden of having been told those symptoms are not real. The community's function in those cases is not primarily informational. It is the restoration of epistemic credibility. Your experience is real. Others have had it. There is a name for it. You're not losing your mind. What the patient community also did over time was contribute to the scientific and regulatory conversation in ways that patient communities had not historically been positioned to do. Organised advocacy groups, including the Alliance for Benzodiazepine Best Practices in the United States and similar organisations in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, brought testimony from affected patients to regulatory hearings, to congressional offices, and to medical education bodies. They funded or prompted research into protracted withdrawal syndrome. They built relationships with sympathetic clinicians and researchers who could translate the patient experience into the language of the clinical literature. The history of how benzodiazepine prescribing guidelines have evolved over the past 2 decades is not a history of scientific discovery alone. It is a history of patient advocacy pressing the clinical system to take seriously what patients had been reporting for decades. That patients had to do this work, that they had to organise, advocate and build their own evidence base to compel a healthcare system to acknowledge a harm that system had caused, is an uncomfortable fact about the institutional dynamics of medicine. It is also, looked at from another angle, a remarkable demonstration of what communities of people with shared experience can accomplish when they are excluded from the formal systems that should be helping them. The benzodiazepine withdrawal community built, through collective effort and mutual support, a body of practical knowledge and political influence that eventually moved the needle on clinical practice. They did it largely without resources, largely without institutional support, and largely while managing the symptoms of the very condition they were trying to get recognised. That is not a story about healthcare failure alone. It is also genuinely a story about human stubbornness and its occasional hard-won victories. The accumulated body of research on benzodiazepines as of the mid-21st century presents a picture that is genuinely more nuanced than either their most enthusiastic proponents or their most alarmed critics have historically acknowledged. They are effective in the short term for anxiety and insomnia. They carry real risks of physical dependence that can emerge more quickly than was originally believed. Long-term cognitive effects, particularly on memory and processing speed, particularly in older adults, are documented and clinically significant. The risk of falls and hip fractures in elderly populations is substantial, and the deep prescribing of benzodiazepines from older patients has become a genuine priority in geriatric medicine. None of this means the drug should not exist. It means they should be used with significantly more care, significantly more follow-up, and significantly shorter duration than the practices of their heyday suggested. The short-term efficacy data are solid and have never been seriously in dispute. Benzodiazepines reduce anxiety, improve sleep onset and maintenance, and reduce physiological markers of stress response in controlled clinical trials, consistently and replicably. For acute anxiety in medical and dental settings, for alcohol withdrawal, for status epilepticus, for the first days or weeks of a panic disorder exacerbation, while a longer-acting treatment is being established, in all of these contexts the evidence supports their use, and the clinical utility is real. The drug works. The question that took decades to answer adequately was not whether it worked, but what it cost, and over what timeline, and in whom. The cognitive effects in older adults have generated a particularly significant and practically important body of research. Multiple large epidemiological studies have found associations between long-term benzodiazepine use and increased risk of cognitive decline, dementia, and falls-related injury, including hip fracture. The causal interpretation of the dementia associations remains contested. The methodological challenge of distinguishing drug effect from the effect of the underlying conditions for which the drug was prescribed is genuinely difficult, but the impairment of memory, attention, and psychomotor speed in current users is not contested and is clinically meaningful. An older adult taking a benzodiazepine chronically for insomnia is demonstrably more likely to fall, more likely to fracture a hip, more likely to present with cognitive impairment on formal testing, and more likely to have drug-related contributions to that impairment that would partially or fully reverse with discontinuation. The deep prescribing evidence is among the most practically important in the contemporary literature. Studies have supported benzodiazepine discontinuation in older adults, providing structured taper schedules, regular clinical review, and psychoeducation about what to expect, consistently show that the majority of patients who attempt tapering can discontinue successfully, and that many report improvement in the symptoms they had attributed to their underlying condition rather than to the drug. Cognitive function improves in a measurable proportion. Sleep quality improves, counterintuitively, once the rebound insomnia of the early taper resolves. Anxiety levels stabilize. These are not trivial findings. They suggest that the drug was, for a significant proportion of long-term users, contributing to the very symptoms it was prescribed to treat, and that discontinuation, difficult, requiring support, not achievable for everyone, produced net benefit. The protracted withdrawal literature remains the most contested area, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that the evidence base is less robust here than in some other domains. The challenge is partly methodological. Prospective studies of protracted withdrawal require following patients for extended periods after discontinuation, with symptom assessments that can distinguish drug effects from relapse, and partly historical, as the condition was not a research priority during the decades when the patient community was developing its own documentation of it. What exists is a body of case series, retrospective surveys, and mechanistic research that is consistent with the existence of a protracted withdrawal syndrome and provides plausible biological underpinnings for it, but does not meet the evidentiary standards of a large prospective controlled clinical trial. Whether protracted withdrawal is neurologically distinct from the anxiety disorders it resembles, and if so in whom and under what conditions, remains genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain, and what the totality of the research supports clearly, is that the prescribing model of the Valium era was wrong in its fundamental assumptions. The assumption that long-term daily benzodiazepine use was safe and appropriate for the majority of anxious patients was not supported by long-term data, because long-term data did not exist, and the model proceeded without it. The assumption that tolerance and dependence were primarily problems of misuse rather than pharmacological inevitability was contradicted by the mechanism of the drugs and eventually by the clinical evidence. The assumption that patients who reported difficulties discontinuing were exhibiting their underlying disorder rather than a drug effect was wrong in a proportion of cases that was large enough to constitute a public health problem. The current research does not vindicate the critics who argued that benzodiazepines should never have been approved or should be removed from the market. It vindicates the more measured position that these are powerful drugs with specific appropriate indications, finite appropriate durations, and real risks that require ongoing clinical attention, a position that should have been the starting point 60 years ago, and is, at last, the clinical consensus today. Benzodiazepines have left a remarkable cultural footprint that testifies to how deeply they penetrated the lived experience of the late 20th century. The Rolling Stones' Mother's Little Helper gave them their most famous pop monument in 1966, but the references spread far beyond that. In literature they appear in Jacqueline Susan's Valley of the Dolls, in Sylvia Plath's journals, in Bret Easton Ellis's cold portrait of 80s excess, in the memoir literature of the 1990s and 2000s by writers documenting their own dependency. In film, Valium appears as a kind of period shorthand for a certain kind of numbed suburban existence. In music, from Lou Reed to Elliott Smith to more recent artists, the benzodiazepine, the benzo, the bar, the xan, recurs as an image of sought-after peace, chemical oblivion, and the complicated intersection of relief and erasure. The Rolling Stones lyric from 1966 is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is doing something more precise than its casual cultural status as the benzo anthem might suggest. Jagger sings about a woman for whom the day's demands are too much, who reaches for the pill that helps her through, and the song's tone is not condemnatory but observational, dry, even sympathetic, with the edge of a critique directed not at the woman but at the world that has made her condition. The song understood, 4 years after Valium's introduction, something that the medical establishment would take another decade to formally acknowledge, that the drug was being used not to treat an illness, but to make a difficult life more manageable, and that the line between those two things was less clear than the prescription model implied. It was a pop song that grasped a pharmaceutical sociology that the clinical literature was still avoiding. The literary treatment of benzodiazepines follows a line of increasing intimacy and honesty across the decades. Jacqueline Suzanne's Valley of the Dolls in 1966 portrayed the pills of the era, barbiturates and tranquilizers combined into the doll of the title, as the currency of a particular kind of female suffering in the entertainment industry, glamorous and lethal and reaching everywhere. Sylvia Plath's journals from the early 1960s document her own encounters with the psychiatric pharmacy of the era with the precision she brought to everything. By the 1990s, with the rise of the personal essay and the addiction memoir as literary forms, benzodiazepines appear in a new mode, as subjects of honest reckoning, of dependency disclosed without euphemism, of withdrawal described from inside. Writers including Elizabeth Wurtzel, whose memoir Prozac Nation dealt more with antidepressants but illuminated the entire psychopharmacological culture of the era, and Lauren Slater, whose work examined the inner life of psychiatric medication, contributed to a literature that was doing something the clinical literature could not, rendering the subjective experience of these drugs with literary specificity. The film treatment has been more uneven and more reliant on the period signifier function. Valium in a film set in the 1970s is an atmospheric prop as much as a plot element, a detail that places the character in her time the way a polyester pantsuit or a wood-panelled station wagon does. The suburban housewife with her prescription bottle appears across films of this era as a figure of anxious sympathy, numbed and isolated, the pill standing in for everything the post-war middle-class social contract promised and failed to deliver. In later films, the drug appears as part of the pharmacological landscape of excess, in the party scene, in the crash scene, in the inventory of a life that has been chemically managed past the point of sustainable management. The cultural function is consistent. Benzodiazepines represent in their film appearances the gap between surface and interior, between the life that appears to be managed and the suffering that is being suppressed rather than resolved. The 21st century iteration of benzodiazepine culture is different again, and in some ways more disturbing in what it reflects. In hip-hop and in the broader youth music culture of the 2010s, Xanax emerged as both a presence and an aesthetic. The genre, sometimes called emo rap or SoundCloud rap, associated with artists including Lil Peep, Juice WRLD, and XXXTentacion, featured benzodiazepines as a central element. The mixing of Xanax bars with codeine cough syrup, the documentation of drug use in music and on social media, the emotional flatness and dissociation that the drug combination produces rendered as both subject matter and sonic texture. The music communicated something that neither the clinical literature nor the policy documents had managed to capture: what it feels like from the inside to be young and in pain, and to have found a chemical that makes the pain quiet. Lil Peep died in 2017, at 21 years old, of an accidental overdose involving fentanyl and alprazolam. Juice WRLD died in 2019, at 20, of a seizure associated with oxycodone and codeine. The pattern was clear enough, and the cultural response was significant. Discussions of drug glamorization in youth music, of the mental health crisis underlying the use, of the pharmaceutical and illicit supply chains that made these combinations available to teenagers. What was sometimes missing from those discussions was the continuity between the 1970s housewife reaching for her Valium and the 20-year-old musician reaching for his Xanax bar. The drugs were different in some respects, and the cultures were very different in others, but the underlying structure was the same: a person in distress, a drug that quieted the distress, a system that made the drug available without adequately managing the consequences. The cultural afterlife of benzodiazepines is not a story that has reached its conclusion. It is a story that keeps finding new narrators, in new contexts, telling versions of the same thing. The search for better anxiety medications, drugs that work quickly, like benzodiazepines, without the dependency profile and cognitive side effects, has been one of the sustained projects of psychopharmacology for the past 3 decades. The results have been, honestly, mixed. Buspirone was introduced in the 1980s as a non-addictive anxiolytic and works for some patients in some contexts, but lacks the immediacy and reliability that made benzodiazepines so attractive. Gabapentinoids like pregabalin show efficacy in some anxiety presentations, but are themselves carrying an increasingly recognized dependency risk. Research into neurosteroids, into kava derivatives, into novel GABA modulators, and into psychedelic-assisted therapy for anxiety disorders continues on multiple fronts. The anxiety, meanwhile, has not gone anywhere. Modern life remains precisely as nerve-wracking as it was when Leo Sternbach's lab assistant found that forgotten compound on a shelf in New Jersey in 1957, and the question of how to quiet the human nervous system without breaking it in the process remains as urgent and as unanswered as it has ever been. Buspirone is the most instructive of the partial answers. When it was introduced in the mid-1980s, it was positioned almost explicitly as the benzodiazepine alternative, a drug that reduced anxiety without producing sedation, without physical dependence, without the cognitive impairment that was by then being recognized as a significant problem with the class. The clinical trials supported these claims, at least in part. Buspirone does not produce the acute sedation of benzodiazepines. It does not produce physical dependence in the benzodiazepine sense. It does not impair memory in the same way. For patients with generalized anxiety disorder who were not previously treated with benzodiazepines, it showed efficacy broadly comparable to diazepam in controlled trials. It was by any reasonable standard a genuine pharmacological advance. The prescribing world received it with something between cautious interest and indifference, because it lacked the one thing that made benzodiazepines so compelling in clinical practice and so attractive to patients. It did not work quickly, and for anxiety sufferers, quickly matters enormously. Buspirone requires 2 to 4 weeks of consistent use before its anxiolytic effects become apparent. For a patient sitting in a physician's office describing a panic attack they had this morning, or the anxiety that is keeping them from functioning at work, or the terror that has been building for days, the offer of a drug that will probably help in about a month is not the same offer as the drug that will help this evening. The immediacy of benzodiazepine relief was not a luxury feature. It was central to the clinical and subjective value of the drugs, and the alternatives that matched their long-term safety profile consistently failed to match their speed. This remains the fundamental problem of anxiety pharmacotherapy. The conditions that benefit most from immediate relief are the conditions that are most vulnerable to the dependency risks that come with the drugs that provide it. The neurosteroid research represents one of the more promising directions, precisely because it targets a fast-acting mechanism, GABA modulation, through a pathway that may not produce the same tolerance and dependency as classical benzodiazepines. Brexanolone, approved by the FDA in 2019 for postpartum depression, and zuranolone, approved in 2023, both target the GABA-A receptor, but at a different site and through a different modulatory mechanism than benzodiazepines, the neurosteroid binding site rather than the benzodiazepine binding site. Early evidence suggests these compounds do not produce the same degree of tolerance with repeated use, which is the crucial pharmacological difference. Whether this advantage holds in larger populations over longer periods of use is the question that current and planned clinical trials are designed to answer. If neurosteroids can reliably provide fast-acting anxiety relief without the benzodiazepine dependency profile, they represent a genuine pharmacological advance rather than a lateral move. The psychedelic-assisted therapy research is perhaps the most unexpected development in the landscape, and the one most difficult to fit into the standard pharmaceutical model. Psilocybin-assisted therapy, in trials for treatment-resistant depression and for anxiety in the context of life-threatening illness, produces anxiety reduction that in some cases persists for months after a single or small number of therapeutic sessions. MDMA-assisted therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, which has anxiety as a central component, has shown efficacy in Phase 3 trials that led the FDA to seriously consider approval, though the path through regulatory review has been complicated. Ketamine and its derivative esketamine, available currently for treatment-resistant depression, produce rapid relief of depressive symptoms that include significant anxiety reduction, with an effect onset measured in hours rather than weeks. None of these are drop-in replacements for benzodiazepines. They work through different mechanisms, require different therapeutic frameworks, and have their own risk profiles and regulatory challenges. Ketamine, notably, is itself a drug with abuse potential and a history of recreational misuse, and the conditions under which it can be prescribed without reproducing the access and dependency problems of the benzodiazepine era require careful attention. The psychedelic compounds are not, in their current clinical form, drugs that a general practitioner writes a prescription for. They are administered in supervised therapeutic settings over multiple sessions, representing a model of care that is resource-intensive, not widely available, and structurally different from the prescription pad model that defined the Valium era. The gap between what is promising in research and what is available in practice is, in anxiety treatment as in most of medicine, large and slow to close. The majority of people with anxiety disorders who seek pharmaceutical treatment today are still offered SSRIs as a first-line treatment, effective for many, inadequate for some, and slow for all. With benzodiazepines as a short-term bridge or acute adjunct, the same basic prescription model that has existed for 30 years with modifications at the edges. The infrastructure for neurosteroid treatment, for psychedelic-assisted therapy, for the more innovative pharmacological approaches being developed in research settings, does not yet exist at the scale required to serve a population in which anxiety disorders are among the most prevalent of all mental health conditions. What the future of anxiety treatment requires is not simply better molecules, though better molecules would help. It requires a healthcare system that can deliver treatment in the time-intensive, monitoring-rich way that managing anxiety well demands. It requires a regulatory framework that can move quickly enough to evaluate and approve promising treatments without cutting corners on safety evaluation in ways that would reproduce the mistakes of the 1960s. It requires a clinical culture that takes the subjective experience of anxiety seriously, that understands the urgency patients feel and does not offer only slow solutions to fast suffering, while also maintaining the long view on the costs of fast solutions that carry long-term risks. And it requires an honest accounting of the 60 years of benzodiazepine history, with all of its relief and all of its costs, as the clearest available map of what happens when these requirements are not met. The map is detailed, the lessons are legible. The question that remains is whether, this time, anyone is reading it. So here you are, at the end of a very long night in a very long story about a very small pill. You have travelled from the waiting rooms of post-war America, where people sat with their unnamed dread and their racing hearts and their polite descriptions of nerves, all the way to the present moment. A moment in which the same anxiety is still present, still widespread, still insufficiently treated, and still reaching for the fastest available relief. The names have changed, the molecules have been refined, the marketing has grown more sophisticated, the warnings more prominent, the prescribing guidelines more carefully worded. And yet the fundamental tension at the centre of this story has not resolved. The nervous system is fragile. Modern life is relentless. The gap between what people need and what the healthcare system can deliver remains, in too many cases, precisely the width of a prescription pad. The people who took these pills, the housewives of the 1970s, the panic disorder patients of the 1980s, the elderly insomniacs of the 1990s, the young musicians of the 2010s, the millions of ordinary people who simply needed to get through the week, were not foolish. They were not weak. They were people in genuine distress who were offered something that helped by institutions they had reason to trust in a culture that told them the help was safe. That the help was sometimes more complicated than advertised is not, in the final accounting, their failure. It is the failure of a system that moved faster than its own knowledge and slower than its own consequences. And yet, and this matters, the story is not only a story of harm. The seizures that did not happen because lorazepam was available in the emergency room, the alcohol withdrawals that were managed safely instead of fatally, the panic attacks that were interrupted before they consumed someone's life entirely, the nights that were survivable because the volume was turned down just enough to allow sleep. These things are real, and they belong in the history alongside the dependency and the dismissal and the protracted withdrawal that nobody believed was happening. What you take with you from all of this is perhaps simply this, that the relationship between a suffering mind and a chemical solution is never as simple as a prescription suggests, that the brain is not a broken machine to be fixed, but a living system to be understood, that quick relief and lasting health are not always pointing in the same direction, and that the difference between them requires time, attention, and a kind of clinical honesty that has not always been available, but is worth continuing to demand. Somewhere tonight, someone is taking their last dose of a benzodiazepine after a 2-year taper. Somewhere else, someone is taking their first, frightened and relieved in equal measure. Somewhere, a researcher is looking at a neurosteroid compound that might one day change the equation. Somewhere, a physician is having the conversation that previous physicians did not have, about duration, about dependency, about what happens when you try to stop. The story is still going, but for tonight it is enough to know it. Dim the light a little further. Let the fan do its quiet work. The history has been told, and the telling is done, and whatever small anxieties arrived with you at the beginning of this evening are for now simply thoughts. Nothing more urgent than that. Sleep well.